Well, folks, it was only maybe 3 weeks ago, more or less, that Betaflight 270 came out, and it seemed like Boris might be slowing down a little bit. It had been a while since 261 came out, and Boris even said that the Betaflight was getting close to, well, as done could be, but you know Boris, he always finds things that he can improve. And he has continued to make improvements, and Betaflight 280 is out, and it's time for me to do another release overview. Now, I will confess that I have not had the chance to fly 280 yet, so I'm lacking a little bit of personal experience with some of these options, but I'll tell you a little secret. I hadn't flown 270 at the time that I did that release overview, so haha, joke's on you, dear viewer. But I have a flight controller right here, in fact, on the desk next to me, and I've got it loaded up, and I'm going to tell you the things that I think I know about Betaflight 280, and as long as I know slightly more than you and don't make too many giant mistakes, we'll all learn something in the process. Well, let's just walk through the release notes now and take them one by one. Changed air mode low throttle protection. So the idea here is that some people don't like when air mode is active when the copter has just been armed and is sitting on the ground. For example, if you've armed and you're idling waiting for a race start, with some people's copters, under some circumstances, with air mode active, the copter would begin to wind up, the props would spin up, and things could get a little hairy. The way this works is, when you first arm the copter, air mode is not active, the props stay calmly idling, waiting for you to race, and then when you raise the throttle past a certain point, and here's the threshold, set air mode activate throttle. And actually this time I've even brought along Betaflight. We can take a look here. Air mode activate throttle, the default is 1350. Whenever the throttle goes above that value, air mode will activate and it'll stay active until you disarm. Added dynamic I term to the dynamic PID feature. So now we have dynamic P, I, and D term. And the idea is that during some flight conditions, it's best to keep the I term from getting too big. When you're flying in fast forward flight and you're relatively stable, the I term builds to a certain value and stays there to counteract any aerodynamic or if your CG is off balance, to counteract those forces and make the copter stay stable. But during extreme moves like flips and rolls, the I term can wind up, and that situation is changing so rapidly that we really don't want that. And so then at the end of the move, the I term can have this accumulated value that it tries to unwind, and that can cause a rebound, for example. Now that's just one example of how I term windup causes problems. The idea here is that the dynamic I term will prevent I term windup in times when the I term doesn't need to wind up, and keep the I term doing its job during times when it is needed. LED strip visual beeper. I don't run LED strip, and I can't test this, and I can't find any documentation on it. But I think I've seen some posts on RC groups indicating that basically this allows the LED strip to flash along with the beeper. So instead of just having the beeper go off, now the LED strip can flash anytime the beeper would be beeping, and you can get visual as well as audible feedback. There is a feature in CleanFlight called yaw jump prevention, or at least there used to be. What yaw jump prevention does is this. When you input a strong yaw move, two motors spin up and two motors spin down, diagonally opposing motors, and at the end of the move, when the stick returns to center, the motors have to reverse themselves very quickly. When this happens, the down spinning motors may not spin down as fast as the up spinning motors spin up. In other words, a motor is very good at making the prop spin faster, but a motor, if the ESC doesn't have very, very strong braking, it's not going to be as good at slowing the prop down as it is at speeding the prop up. And what this means is that there's a net increase in thrust. In other words, if the up spinning motors spin up quickly and the down spinning motors spin down slowly, there's a net increase in thrust. Those two don't balance each other out. The way this manifests itself is that you do a sharp yaw move, and at the end of the move, the copter sort of bounces up in the air. It gains altitude or gains thrust. That's called a yaw jump. What yaw jump prevention does is it limits the P term on yaw when the yaw stick is centered. In other words, at the end of a yaw move, the yaw stick will be centered, and this prevents the P term from getting very large. The idea being that if we limit the P term, then the motors will not respond as aggressively, and the copter will not jump up in the air. The flip side of that, though, is that the end of your yaw moves may not be as sharp. It may be a little bit soft, and even in some cases you may end up with some rebound or overshoot. So finding the right balance for yaw jump prevention can be important. If you have a copter that has very, very good braking on the ESCs, you may be able to actually reduce the amount of yaw jump prevention you've got, and you'll get crisper stops at the end of your yaw moves. Now, the thing is, many of us don't do very extreme yaw moves to begin with, so you may not have noticed that your yaw moves could have crisper stops. But if you want to try to get crisper stops out of your yaw moves, you may reduce yaw jump prevention, allow the P term to be larger at the end of a yaw move. On the other hand, if you've noticed motors surging and your copter popping up in the air at the end of yaw moves, and specifically at the end of yaw moves, that's the only time this is relevant, is when the yaw stick is centered, which is likely to be at the end of a yaw move. If you've noticed your copter popping up in the air during that time, you may want to increase the amount of yaw jump prevention you've got. But there's so many clean flight options or beta flight options that are only accessible via the command line. And one of the goals of this release, release 2.8, is to get some of those things into the configurator. Now, of course, we could do like Raceflight and just release our own configurator and have all these custom options in the GUI. Just tick boxes and enter numbers into text boxes. But we're not quite there yet. So instead what we're doing is we're taking the existing text boxes and we're just reusing them. So it's been a while since the D term was actually removed from yaw. If you check yours, you may see that your yaw D gain is 0 if you're on a previous version of Betaflight. And the reason for that is that it's not even being used. It's just ignored. You can set it to whatever number you want. It won't make a difference. If you're changing it and you think it makes a difference, you're probably imagining it, unless you're on a much older firmware where it did get applied. So the idea is, since we're not using it anyway, let's use it for yaw jump prevention. And the way it works is that if this is at 0, you have the maximum amount of yaw jump prevention. Your copter will have very soft stops at the end of yaw moves, and the motors will be not surging at all. So the way this works is that the higher this parameter, which is not D gain, it is not D gain, it just is using this text box. The higher this parameter, the more yaw jump prevention you've got. And the lower this parameter, the less yaw jump prevention you've got. So if you notice your motor surging and your copter popping up in the air a little bit at the end of aggressive yaw moves, you raise this parameter. And if you want to try and sharpen up the ends of your yaw moves, lower this parameter. But watch out for the yaw jumps. It used to be that if you wanted to use multi-shot or one-shot 42 or anything like that, you had to enable one-shot in the GUI. So you had to go to the configuration and enable one-shot 125. And that was a little confusing because we're not using one-shot, I'm using multi-shot. Why do I have to enable one-shot? The reason for that is that in older versions of Betaflight, one-shot parameter was actually, it really was fast PWM. So should I use fast PWM or should I use traditional regular PWM to talk to the ESCs? When you enabled this one-shot parameter, you were really enabling one-shot 125, one-shot 42, multi-shot, all of those things, and you would pick which one you wanted in the CLI. But that was pretty confusing to some people. So in this version of Betaflight, Boris has decoupled this parameter from the option to use other types of fast PWM. This parameter is only turned on if you are actually using one-shot 125. What I recommend you do here is you just forget about this. Forget about that. Don't worry about that. Just go here and use the command line and set fast PWM protocol to the PWM protocol you want. Now, if you want to use the old PWM protocol, then set it to off. But don't do that. Don't do that. What is this? 2014? Come on, don't use that. At least use one-shot. You can also use one-shot 42 or multi-shot. Just forget about that GUI option. Just do it from the command line. That would be my suggestion. In older versions of Betaflight, the expo values were pre-calculated, entered into a table, and were looked up from a table during flight. Now, these processors are more than fast enough to do these calculations on the fly, and now they are. Now, the real question, though, is the expo curve getting any smoother? And the answer to that is yes, but also no. So it used to be that the expo curve, if you go to the configurator and you look at the expo curve, you can see that is this lovely, let me just make it a larger number. Oh, there we go. You can see that it's this lovely curve. Oh, isn't that nice? But actually, it's not a lovely smooth curve. In older versions of Betaflight, it actually only had 5 points of delineation. So it was doot, 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 a jagged line. And in Betaflight 2.7, Boris added more points, so we got a smoother curve, but it's still not a perfectly smooth expo curve. And if you think you've noticed a jump in your stick travel, like you move the stick a little bit and the copter moves a certain speed, and then you move it just a little more and suddenly the copter's moving faster, well, that may be what you were picking up on. And for those who like the KISS FC's smooth response, maybe that's what you're noticing, is that the KISS FC doesn't do it that way. Well, so now these values are calculated in real time, but that's actually not where the magic is. The magic is that Boris has reworked Super Expo so that Super Expo can actually just completely replace the old style Expo. Now, many of us were playing with Super Expo in addition to the old style Expo, and some people didn't like the sort of unpredictable feel of it. The idea now with 280 is that you can actually remove the old style Expo entirely, and you can use Super Expo to completely replace it, giving a smoother and more natural, some people like it better, feel to the stick. What I would suggest you do is that you just try it yourself and see if you like the feel. Some people will be used to the old style Expo and won't notice the steps in the Expo curve. Other people will really prefer the new style Super Expo. So let me tell you about the commands used to configure Expo under Betaflight 280. Now, first of all, Super Expo is now a feature. If you have Super Expo rates enabled, then you're using the new Super Expo. And if you have Super Expo rates disabled, then you're using the old style rates. Now, what does that mean? If we go to the PID tuning tab, remember that we've got roll rate and pitch rate, but then we've also got RC rate. And that's always been a little bit confusing as to what that does. Why do we have these two different places to set the rates? And if you've been doing this long enough, if you're an old timer like me and you've been doing this for 2 whole years, maybe even 3, then you remember that the way MultiWii worked is that the RC rate set the sort of base linear rate, and then the roll and pitch rates gave a kind of Super Expo-like relaxation in the rates to allow the copter to basically flip and roll really fast. So if you added just a little bit of roll and pitch rate, the copter would get much more extreme at full stick deflection while still staying relatively soft at mid stick. Whereas if you added a lot of RC rate and not much pitch and roll rate, the copter would be super twitchy all the time. Well, this is something like that. The way it works is that RC rate sets your base rate of movement. RC Expo controls the amount of old style Expo, which the recommendation is with 280 to keep this very low. You'll see the default is 0.10, and Boris even suggests turning it off and just setting it to 0. And then the roll and pitch rate set the amount of Super Expo if Feature Super Expo rates is turned on. If Feature Super Expo rates is turned off, then the roll and pitch rate work the way they used to, which basically just means that they're a linear addition to the RC rate. So you just, adding additional rates in the RC rate or the roll and pitch rates, it didn't really matter where you added them. The only difference here was that the roll and the pitch rate could be used to independently adjust the roll and the pitch axis in the old style rates. With Super Expo enabled, this is controlling the amount of Super Expo on each axis, and this is controlling your base rate, and this is controlling your old style Expo. So, what if you want to put things back the way you had them? Well, you could just disable Feature Super Expo rates, and you could also set your roll and your pitch Super Expo rate to 0. And that probably wouldn't be exactly the same, I don't know, but it would be similar. Boris actually recommends that you have just a little bit of Super Expo because of the way it smooths out the stick travel and the rates. So even if you don't like Super Expo, try putting just a little bit in and see if it smooths out your sticks and gives a little better stick feel. Now, you can actually download from here. This is on the Betaflight release for 2.8. You can download this spreadsheet and you can play with the rates and experiment and look at the differences. So for example, let's start with a base RC rate of 100 and an old style expo of 0 and a pitch and roll rate of 75. And that produces this result. This is our resulting curve. Whereas in the old style, we would get this because we have no RC expo. If we set 75% our old style expo, look at the difference in the curves. Now, first of all, do you see these jagged lines here that it is not a smooth curve? Right? So that's that old style rates where we don't have a smooth curve. We have a sort of a semi-jagged line. Could you feel that in flight? I think it's debatable whether you could feel that, but some people might say that they could feel it and they prefer this. The other thing I want you to notice is, notice that when I added the RC Expo, it also changed the new style rates. So RC Expo is still active. The old style Expo is still active even when you're using Feature Super Expo rates. So let's just compare 75% of regular Expo with 75% Super Expo. And notice the huge difference. Super Expo has a much more extreme, if you will. When you get to the end of the stick travel, Super Expo goes much more extreme. So here's 75% regular Expo, and here's 75% Super Expo. Big difference. My recommendation would be that you leave RC Expo at a very low value, like 10%, which is the default, that you set the RC rate, start at 100, and then raise or lower that based on the amount of mid-stick speed you want, or twitchiness, if you will, and then raise and lower the Super Expo rate, which again is controlled by the pitch and roll rate here on the PID tuning tab. Raise and lower that value to adjust the amount of speed you want at the full stick deflection. Raising and lowering this value will also affect the mid-stick feel. A higher value here will give a softer mid-stick feel, so it's going to take some playing around to find the optimal values for your particular flight style. And it will probably feel different than you're used to, but give it a chance and you may come to like it. Many people really love the feel of the KISS flight controller, and Betaflight has not fully implemented all of the differences that KISS has in its flight controller. But one of the things KISS has is this style of Expo as opposed to the old style of Expo that is in Clean Flight and older versions of Betaflight. So you may get a more smooth, natural KISS feel out of Betaflight using Super Expo. And I've talked about that for a while, but that's probably the single biggest change that's in this version of Betaflight. So it really deserves talking about, and a lot of people are confused about it. There's a new feature, which is an experimental anti-ESC desync option. The idea here is that the flight controller, especially in recent versions of Betaflight and Clean Flight, where the flight controller is running faster than ever, can really jerk the ESC around, and many ESCs can't keep up. The idea with this feature is that we will set the maximum amount of change that we will allow the flight controller to make in each loop. And this causes the flight controller to just go a little bit easier on the ESC. If you think you're having sync problems, you may help that out by raising this value. The command line option is anti-desync power step. And if we go to the command line, we can see that it can be ranged from 0 to 10,000. The default value for this is 10,000, and most people should leave it at the default value. If you want to disable it entirely, set it to 0, or set it to some other value where the lower the value, the more restrictive you will be on the flight controller. Now be careful, because lowering this value also makes the flight controller less responsive. So you want this value to be as high as possible, but if you're getting issues, what you think are sync issues, and if you can't solve it by changing your ESC, DMAG compensation, or motor timing, if you'd rather try and solve it in the flight controller, set this value to a lower number. Just drop it down, down, down. And I've heard values between 1,000, 2,000, 500. Just jump around in a methodical way to find the value that fixes the problem. So for example, you could use a binary search algorithm, if that means anything to you. Basically what it means is you would go from 10,000 to 5,000. Did that fix it? No. Cut it in half again, 2,500. Did that fix it? Yes. Okay, now work your way back up again. So you know that the optimal value is somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 now, so now you work your way back up again, and eventually you home in on an optimal number that fixes your desync problems, but still allows you to have as much responsiveness as possible. Boris has changed the way that yaw rates are calculated. Yaw rate has the same scaling as pitch and roll rate. Yaw rate is not affected by RC rate. It uses essentially a fixed RC rate of 1. So basically the way yaw rate is calculated has changed, and you won't be able to copy your same rates over from previous versions of Betaflight. Super Expo rates and air mode are features now. Now air mode is a little confusing because, check it out, if I go to the modes tab, notice that air mode is a mode, and that means that I can put it on a switch just like I normally do. But if you're like me, you turn air mode on all the time. Well, if you want air mode on all the time, you can just say feature air mode, and air mode is now on all the time. And that's what I plan to do. I like air mode, and I want it on all the time. Well, if you do that, please notice that air mode is no longer in your modes. And by the way, if you have your mode set up and you enable feature air mode, you must go back and check that you haven't screwed up the modes, because they will reorder themselves, and what used to control air mode will now be controlling something else, and that could definitely get you in trouble if, for example, that's fail-safe or something else like that. So if you want to switch air mode on and off in flight, disable the feature and use the modes tab. If you want air mode on all the time, well, certainly one way to do it is just like that. Now it's on all the time. You could also do it as a feature. It's your call. There's no difference really that I'm aware of. Yaw now has RC rate. You can actually configure the RC rate. Set RC rate yaw. It's not in the configurator yet, but if you want to change the RC rate for yaw versus the yaw rate, like the roll and pitch rate, then you can. Now, I don't actually know what the difference is here. For example, is there Super Expo on yaw? I think there is, because I think I remember that being added in Betaflight 2.7.1, maybe 2.7.0. So I believe that we are moving towards a realm where all three axes, pitch, roll, and yaw, have equal and parallel configuration parameters. It's usually been the case that the yaw axis has not been configured the same as the pitch and roll axis, and it seems like we're moving away from that. And now yaw will have an RC rate and a yaw rate, just like pitch and roll have an RC rate and a pitch and a roll rate, where again the pitch and roll rate control the Super Expo factor, and the RC rate controls the base speed of the axis. With all these changes to rates, it will be possible to get yourself in trouble. The gyro chip that we use has a maximum rate of 2,000 degrees per second. And if you go over that rate, if your copter spins faster than 2,000 degrees per second, the gyro chip will, well, it'll potentially output invalid values. Bad things will happen if you go over 2,000 degrees per second. So here, Betaflight will prevent you from ever setting the rates higher than 2,000 degrees per second. So if you're playing around with RC rate and Super Expo and all these things, and you could accidentally get yourself in a scenario where you put in a really high Super Expo rate. See? Oh man, look at that. Now we're at 1,080 degrees per second, right? And even higher. We're off the end of the chart here. In order to save you from yourself, Betaflight will now prevent you from exceeding 2,000 degrees per second. And now we can change everything via the configurator using the rates and the RC rates. We don't have to go into the command line to change anything except for this, that'll be changing soon. But more and more of this stuff is being moved into the configurator. We're sort of consolidating these options into something so that there's not a million command line options, and things can just be configured in the configurator. So this version of Betaflight has been a bit of a shakeup, but it's a good shakeup, and it's a little bit of pain now, but it'll make things simpler in the future. There's always been a lot of confusion about the way that rates work. If you were flying multi-wii, then your pitch and your roll rates did something different than if you were flying LuxFloat and rewrite, and there's a lot of questions and a lot of confusion about that. With Betaflight 2.8.0, we are moving in a direction where all of these things work consistently. And it hurts now for those of us who are used to the old way of doing it, but for people who come into it in the future, it's really going to help. And I think if we can get our minds around it, it'll help us too. That's Betaflight 2.8.0. I hope this has been helpful. And as always, happy flying.